Live everywhere on netrootsradio.com. David Waldman, Kagro, in the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, there's the button. Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Tuesday, June 18th, 2024. Time for another show. Tuesday, what are we on here? I think the third Tuesday of Donald Trump's career as a convicted felon. And we have to keep counting these things because, as I noted in today's startup post here, the announcement post, we can't be sure forever that this is going to be the case. Of course, if Donald Trump somehow finds himself back in the White House by whatever methodology, there's every reason to believe that he would not only pardon himself but seek to expunge his own record and then thereby undo and deny the fact that he's a convicted felon, even though we all have seen it happen. So I guess we count it while we have the opportunity to do so. All right, much happening today. It is a Tuesday. We'll see if we can get connected with Joan McCarter later today in our final segment to catch up on what she's been watching happen in Congress. And a lot of that has to do with, can you believe it, political infighting among Republicans, which we don't really have a great word for yet. It's not that we don't have anything fun and alliterative like the old Democrats in disarray, which you can always just haul that out. And, of course, you can use it ironically to describe what's going on among the Republicans, since we can't or haven't yet come up with an alliterative Republicans in something or GOP in something. But everyone can work on that. You're encouraged to do so. Submit your suggestions, I guess, via, social media, email, you tell me. And we'll see. We'll try a couple of them out. But, think of it like the naming of bills when they try to work out an acronym that will work well. Which reminds me, by the way, you remember the Wipes Act? I got some email about that, as a matter of fact, over at Daily Kos, and let me check in on it again and see exactly what it was I was looking at, because it was the whole episode was kind of odd, of course, but oh yes, it's our good friend San Francisco Bay Transplant, SF Bay Transplant, and we always joke that we can't be sure that it's San Francisco, it's just SF. Could be some other bay that we don't know about in an SF place. Or maybe that's just, their code for staying clean on the radio, and it's two bleepable words about a bay they don't like very much. Anyway, look, this is a legitimate thing. This was basically what we were trying to get to here. That I didn't say it wasn't. I just thought it was a little odd. And it's a weird subject matter for Congress to be legislating on. But as it turns out, it's a real issue, and a real issue especially in areas with aging municipal water treatment. And not only are there people who believe that, well, there are these wipes that say they're flushable and then these wipes that say they're not or don't say that they are, but they're all wipes, so let's flush them all, and it causes problems. But as it turns out, the ones in some of these systems in particular, the ones that say they're flushable are not. They say they are, but they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing or what they claim to be doing, or maybe the claims are being made based on updated water treatment standards, or maybe based on nothing. And maybe that is an area where, yes, although you wouldn't have imagined it in 1776, this is a place where Congress might have to legislate. Some of the wipes that are advertised as flushable are not, in fact, flushable and cause all kinds of problems. And so now you have all the wipe news that you needed to. And yuck. How gross is that? Anyway, so, it may end up now, knowing that this is now the case. And this is a great example of everything having nuance. Even wipes have nuance. And, worse than that, what's likely to happen now, of course, is there'll be Republican outrage. They're trying to take away our wipes, which should be really, I'd love to see you try and campaign on that one. But Yeah, well, you should use more LED light bulbs rather than, the standard incandescent light bulbs. They're bad for the environment generally, and they waste a lot of electricity. You could lower your own electricity bills. Pay less to the electric company. What do you say? No, they're trying to take away my light bulbs. Hey, your gas stove is emitting toxins over time that could really adversely affect your health. What if we labeled those things as such and made strides to try to make available improved electric ovens that wouldn't do this? And you could buy them if you wanted to. They're trying to take away our stoves. So what else is on the list? Trump, of course. Showers, toilets, dishwashers. I guess anything that uses water. Gas stoves, electric lights, and now our wipes. Our yargle bargle. So now we see this coming, and boy, well, that won't be disgusting. We want to stay a million miles away from that controversy. Anyway, so now you're up to date on all the wipe news. And instead, I was scanning the front pages over at Daily Kos, actually looking to see, all right, well, what have I got? Let's queue up what Joan is working on and see if we can't lay the groundwork for the discussion with her later. But I got stopped in my tracks because I ran into something on the front page that, the little videos that flip through and say, all right, what's going on here? And I saw the headline, House Republican wants to have Attorney General arrested just because. Okay, let's find out what's going on there. And I clicked on it, and Walter Einenkel has covered this one for Daily Kos. And the lunatic in question is Anna Paulina Luna from Florida. One of the, flat out, usually just weirdest, dumbest, most outlandish Republicans out there. But it's very hard to get into the upper echelons there. There are far worse, of course, but she's one of the loonier members, and it's no play on the name. It just happens to be true that, she chose a matrix glitch of a name to run with. But this is interesting. It piqued my interest because, of course, I'm familiar with this topic. And it does get better treatment later on in the story, but I was kind of like, wait a minute, what's going on here at Daily Kos that they don't recognize this? But you know how it is with the youngsters these days. They don't know what the old timers did. GOP, or Gop, Representative Anna Paulina Luna of Florida, best known for fabricating her entire life story. I think we read about that. But if you didn't, you might want to catch up on that one. Told Fox News that she has a plan to get the Sergeant-at-Arms to arrest Attorney General Merrick Garland. Oh, yeah. Several months ago, she says, I introduced a resolution for something called inherent contempt. Okay, inherent contempt of Congress, of course. This is something that Congress has the authority to do, and it hasn't done since the early 1900s, 1930s or so. She told host Maria Bartiromo on Monday. Luna was responding to questions about the Justice Department's announcement that it would not prosecute Garland, of course, for not turning over audio of President Joe Biden's interview with Special Counsel Robert Hur. And then some quote, and what that allows Congress to do is really be the punitive arm, and really hold Garland accountable by using the Sergeant-at-Arms to essentially go and get him, Luna went on, as well as the tapes. Bring him to the well of the House and really be a check and balance on the Department of Justice. Like most of what Luna says, Walter Einenkel continues here, there are all kinds of facts being misrepresented here. For one, her assertion that she introduced her inherent contempt of Congress resolution several months ago is belied by the fact she actually announced it on May 7th. So that's not several months ago. That's true. It's interesting, though. The balance of the response here is sort of like, what? This is garbage. There's something called inherent contempt. And, of course, there is something called inherent contempt. And it does, in fact, kind of work this way. But they do point out later on there are some important differences, and let's get into some of those. So, but first, remember that she made up her entire life story, so that's not great in terms of credibility. She said she introduced some sort of resolution several months ago. She did not. And while that is technically more than 1 month if she did it on May 7th, it is far less than several months if you feel like quibbling about this. Though, to be fair, her announcement could have been missed since it came the same day that Stormy Daniels was testifying in Trump's criminal trial, by the way. Now, the Sergeant-at-Arms is the Chamber's primary law enforcement official and protocol officer, responsible for maintaining security on the House floor and the House side of the U.S. Capitol complex. True. And a quote from what? There's a link here. A CRS report on the subject. The case from the early 1900s that Luna is referring to is something that some legal scholars felt was more apropos to the unwillingness to comply with requests from Congress by the Trump administration. The early 1900s case was related to the Teapot Dome scandal. Do you remember it from history in high school? Do they even teach it anymore? I don't know. I went to high school closer to the Teapot Dome scandal, so maybe that was it. Actually, I mean, quite honestly, it's coming up on pretty soon it'll be longer between high school and whenever now is, when this happens. It's still probably 10 years away, but Teapot Dome was like, 50 to 60 years old, I guess, when they were teaching it in high school. Okay, we're getting to about that point. Anyway, the Teapot Dome scandal, which involved President Warren G. Harding's Secretary of the Interior, Albert Bacon Fall, and his no-bid contract to lease federal oil fields in Teapot Dome, Wyoming. It happened in 1922. All right, so we got some more years to go here, I guess. I was thinking, the inherent contempt proceedings was probably stretched into the early 30s. Anyway, Attorney General Harry M. Daugherty was heavily criticized at the time for not more thoroughly investigating Fall, who was later convicted of taking a $100,000 bribe. That's a pretty big bribe in 1922. The scandal escalated to the Senate subcommittee subpoenaing Malley S. Daugherty, the Attorney General's brother. When Malley Daugherty refused to show up to testify before Congress, the Senate Sergeant-at-Arms David S. Barry deputized John J. McGrane to arrest him and bring him to Washington to testify. The Republicans' fixation on getting audio, despite having already received the entire transcript of Her's interview with Biden, has been a transparently political endeavor. Her, a Republican, released a 375-page report in February saying that no charges were warranted and that Biden had likely kept the documents as a private citizen by mistake. Since then, House Republicans have voted to hold Garland in contempt. Speaker Mike Johnson vowed to take the Garland contempt case to court after the DOJ announced it planned no further action. But whether Johnson will bring Luna's resolution to a vote remains to be seen. There has been very little tangible action that has come out of the Gops never-ending political theater. This past year, it spent an inordinate amount of time attacking Biden's border security while trying to impeach Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas, a stunt that failed miserably. Luna's newest resolution is the Gops' latest political stunt to create a cloud of doubt over Biden's re-election campaign against convicted felon Trump. So it's out there. It's a real thing. I'm kind of interested in seeing how it progresses. It would be interesting to see if they bring Luna's resolution to the floor and what they are able to do with it. I wouldn't be opposed to awakening people to the reality that inherent contempt is a real thing and a tool that can actually be used. It is a little dangerous in their hands, of course, but it's dangerous in anybody's hands, potentially. But sometimes, I don't know. I mean, I guess it's recognized as a concept because sometimes it's imagined to, in fact, be necessary. And certainly Trump's administration, such as it was more along the lines of what the, I don't know whether the framers really talked very much about inherent contempt, but certainly more along the lines of balancing the equities among the branches, or more easily envisioned as necessary to balance the equities among the branches in an executive supremacist setting. As, for an authoritarian executive at that, like in the Trump administration, and the one we imagine is yet to come, should he somehow find himself returned to power. So, Anyway, just want to point out, Anna Paulina Luna, not entirely crazy and in this respect, and didn't make up inherent contempt. It's a real thing. It actually happened. And it's not entirely necessary that it make a great deal of sense. If a relevant body, House of Congress, is willing to put a solid majority, well, even a slim majority, an actual majority behind such a resolution, they can direct the Sergeant-at-Arms to do this. The Sergeant-at-Arms at that point probably has a couple of options in how to comply. And then, of course, there's the option of not complying. I don't know whether that's something anybody would imagine would happen. I mean, the Sergeant-at-Arms is a political appointee and more or less employed at will by the majority and could easily be replaced by someone who would agree to do the job. How you would execute it exactly as against the head of the Department of Justice, who has his own armed police force, I'm not entirely sure. Who knows how that works out? I have no idea exactly how you would balance that out. And I guess I wouldn't put it past a Trump administration, if it was in the shoes of Merrick Garland and being pursued by the House Sergeant-at-Arms and deputies from the Capitol Police, I wouldn't put it past them to say the orders are to shoot this out. I imagine if there were a dispatching of officers from the Capitol Police to effect an arrest of Merrick Garland at I'm sure the instructions would be, well, let's de-escalate this as soon as possible. But I mean, if ultimately they were there and insistent, I can actually imagine Merrick Garland saying, all right, everybody, that's all right. I'll go. I'll be out by lunchtime. We'll straighten this out. And like, oh, now what? This might not work out all that well. So I have no idea where it goes. And because I have no idea where it goes, I imagine Mike Johnson also has no idea where it goes. And it's the sort of thing that ordinarily you'd say, all right, well, someone responsible enough to be sitting in the position of Speaker of the House will say, if I don't know where this ends, I'm not bringing it up. But I don't know whether that's going on in their heads. Maybe they might just be like, 1, 2, 3 miracle. God's going to fix it in some way. I'll just have a vote and we'll see what happens. So I don't know. But boy, it's pretty interesting. And, there was an extensive writings on inherent contempt once upon a time over at Daily Kos, and people just don't seem to know about it. Oh, well, too bad. All things are like this. And all glory fades. No one remembers. Oh, well, at least we have the radio show where we can complain about that. And you can say, I remember, even when you don't. I remember you talking about it. That's the important part. Okay, let's see. Other things, very interesting stories being circulated today. There are several. As I said, there's some setup we could do for Joan's segment that perhaps we can get to in the middle of the show, just sort of setting up this concept which will become the Republican version of Democrats in disarray, however we choose to name it. Anyway, let's see. Some of the other stories getting lots of attention this morning. I thought this was an interesting one, and viewed by and circulated by Radley Balco on social media. It is, in fact, a Mark Joseph Stern article in Slate magazine, and it's about one of our other favorite topics and something I'm sure we'll talk to Joan a bit about, the Supreme Court. This is an interesting take and has generated a lot of discussion. Amy Coney Barrett, the headline tells us, sounds fed up with Clarence Thomas's sloppy originalism. And I think it's all sloppy originalism. There's no such thing as good, tight, well-reasoned originalism. It's a foolish idea to begin with. But on top of all of that, if you are not spelling your words with the long S that the originalists use, that kind of looks like an F, such that you might read the original document and notice that it mentions a role for what looks like congreffs, but is in fact just Congress. The long S has been phased out of everyday usage in the English language. I don't know when it exactly faded out, but you could find a Wikipedia article about it that will tell you all about it and tell you when we abandoned this thing. But hey, that's the way the founders wanted it spelled, and I don't know. I mean, can you make an originalist argument? I don't believe Congress had the authority to do this. Congress had that authority, but now we have just a Congress. It's like... which reminded me that sometimes a lot of this originalism crap, particularly the worst decisions among them, and those that are, in fact, turn out to be ahistorical entirely, but they claim the mantle of historical scholarship, which is what is getting so much of the discussion going this morning about this article. But if the scholarship is so bad and you can just pretty much make up whatever you want as you go along, it reminds me more... let's say it reminds me less of rigorous historical legal scholarship than it does of the weird move, well, they're all weird moves, from the sovereign citizens who find themselves hauled into court and facing criminal charges and say, aha, you have gold fringe on your flag. That means this is an admiralty court, or what, I don't even know what the stupid claim is. And it's an improper venue and you have no jurisdiction over me, besides which I'm a natural person and you should be suing the corporation that was formed in my name under the blah, blah, blah. They have a weird ideology that governs what they do. And of course, they can also make things up as they go along. But anyway, I just thought that was interesting. It strikes me more like sovereign citizen sophistry than any sort of rigorous legal analysis. And I guess it strikes not only Mark Joseph Stern, but Amy Coney Barrett that way sometimes too. Let's take a look at this. Look at this. This is weird. It has loaded up funny. Let me try and reload the page and see if maybe that helps. Of course not. And I don't even know if it's related to the pocket issue, but like the first line of the story is obliterated for some reason. But here it is. A minor dispute over a trademark registration erupted into a heated battle over originalism at the Supreme Court last week. Did you know that? Splintering the justices into warring camps over the value and practicality of history in constitutional analysis. Okay. Well, it looks like, you know what? I'm sorry. I see what's going on here. It's not that the first line was obliterated, but rather that the graphic that illustrates the piece begins with an excerpt from the decision that they're talking about. And that is not, the first line of that is not fully visible. But I don't need to actually read you that one. Okay, back to the story here for the next couple of minutes. Right, no surprise there. That is, warring camps over the value and practicality of history and constitutional analysis. No surprise as the term accelerates towards a contentious finale. The tensions roiling major cases are bound to spill over into littler ones. That's interesting. That's true. It's a good point. Remember, they're debating all these things all at once, and they're not always, therefore, crafted as discrete cases that have nothing to do with one another, because they're all weighing on the minds of the justices and the clerks at the same time as they're writing each opinion. So that's just a good mechanical reminder of what's going on. What's remarkable, he continues, is who seized on this squabble over intellectual property to launch a scathing salvo against the conservative majority's laser-like focus on supposed history and tradition. It's Justice Amy Coney Barrett, a conservative who presented as a true believer in originalism when joining the Supreme Court 4 years ago. And it may be that she actually is a true believer in originalism and thinks that Clarence Thomas's version of it is, well, crap. Barrett's latest opinion exudes disenchantment with the methodology, at least as it's used by this court. It also suggests she has buyer's remorse about signing on to Bruin, a significant expansion of the Second Amendment that's arguably the most radical and unworkable originalist opinion she's joined so far. Is that, I'm not even yet familiar with the name, is that the most recent one about, no, it's not the one about bump stocks, but this is the New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruen, Bruen, Superintendent of New York State Police. But all right, offhand, I can't recall the specifics of it, but we'll see if it becomes necessary to understanding the article. At any rate, the writing continues. We will know soon enough. That is what? Whether or not there's buyer's remorse here. Last week's squabble reads like shadowboxing over a much bigger decision to come. U.S. versus Rahimi, a follow-up to the Bruen decision. Rahimi gives the court an opportunity to walk back the most disastrous and lethal aspects of its Second Amendment extremism. Barrett now seems like she may be eager to take it. Vidal versus Elster, last Thursday's decision, is not the kind of case that usually makes headlines. Steve Elster is a labor lawyer who wanted to trademark the phrase Trump too small, inspired by Marco Rubio's crude debate joke about Donald Trump's hands in 2016. Okay. What an aspiration that is. The Patent and Trademark Office, however, refused to register the trademark, citing a law that bars trademarks made up of a name identifying a particular living individual except by his written consent. Needless to say, the former president did not give his consent. Elster sued, alleging a violation of the First Amendment. This guy has a lot of time on his hands, but, he's a lawyer. He can do this stuff, on the cheap, if not actually for free. Anyway, he pointed out that the Supreme Court has held that two similar provisions of federal law violate free speech. One that bars disparaging trademarks, and another that bars immoral or scandalous trademarks. So, he argued, the prohibition against trademarks that use other people's names, the so-called names clause, it's a good name for the clause, should also be declared unconstitutional. Is he right? We'll be right back. Hi everybody, it's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. We were in the middle of Mark Joseph Stern's article in Slate magazine noting that Amy Coney Barrett may be growing fed up with Clarence Thomas's sloppy originalism. So we were in the middle of laying the groundwork for what? Where is she hanging her hat for this? It is on a trademark decision issued last Thursday that you wouldn't think would lead to something like this. And, well, frankly, you wouldn't think the Supreme Court would need to bother spending any time on, but there are these weird little nuances and issues of federal law that somebody needs to clear up, and this is supposed to be their job. They're actually supposed to spend most of their time doing these stupid little fixes and cleanups on finer points of law and not deciding broader and far dumber things that everybody has assumed for the entirety of the existence of the United States was not a real concept, absolute presidential immunity. But I digress. So there we are in Vidal versus Elster. We're talking about Steve Elster, a labor lawyer who wanted to trademark the phrase Trump too small for, dumb/prurient reasons. But what the hell? Why shouldn't he be able to do that? Well, as it turns out, there's a law that says you can't have that includes the names clause. You can't trademark or register a trademark that uses the name identifying a particular living individual except by his written consent. Okay. Seems actually kind of straightforward and reasonable, but Is it a First Amendment violation? Well, then we have one kind of test. Well, can the government bar that sort of speech? Is there a compelling state interest in it, et cetera, et cetera? And you can have that fight. But he also pointed out there are two other similar provisions of federal law that violate free speech in the trademark area. And those two things, one that bars disparaging trademarks and another that bars immoral or scandalous trademarks, that have been successfully argued against, I guess, at the Supreme Court level. The prohibition against trademarks that use other people's names should also be declared unconstitutional, he says. Now, what happened? Here the Supreme Court unanimously ruled against Elster, upholding the statute. Oh, no. I mean, it seems fair. Does it really need to be done in order to preserve what we would call free speech in this country? You can say Trump too small. You just can't trademark it and force other people who want to say the same free speech thing to pay you. That's not particularly free, that speech, but okay. Anyway, we understand that that's, free doesn't mean without cost. But anyway, the justices fractured badly, though, on the reason why Elster couldn't do it, dividing more or less into a 5-4 split. So everybody said no. 5 people said no for this reason. 4 people said no for that reason. And they were very angry about the difference in the reasons. Writing for the 5 men, Justice Clarence Thomas relied exclusively upon history, or his version of it, to resolve the case. Because why use law? Right? Typically, he explained, laws that discriminate on the basis of content, that is, their topic or idea or message, are subject to heightened scrutiny under the First Amendment. And by targeting trademarks that reference other people, the names clause is a content-based regulation of speech. But Thomas then declared that the law is not constitutionally suspect because it aligns with the history and tradition of the nation since the founding. Trademark restrictions have always turned on a mark's content, yet have always coexisted with the First Amendment, so they represent an exception to the usual constitutional limitations. Embarking upon a grand journey from the 1700s through today, Thomas presented a smattering of comparable laws from the past to demonstrate this historical rule, as he put it. In short, he concluded, it has always been done, so it may always be done. Case closed. In a separate opinion, Barrett agreed with Thomas's bottom line, but sharply disagreed with pretty much everything else. His history-only approach, she wrote, was wrong twice over. Thomas both botched the relevant history, unsurprising, I guess, and failed to make a persuasive case for its use in the first place. Start with the court's evidence, which is enclosed in scare quotes here. Thomas's law office history, Barrett explained, consists of loosely related cases from the late 19th and early 20th century that do not, quote, establish a historical analog for the names clause, unquote. His analysis of these cases is shallow and often dubious. Barrett highlighted unfounded inferences in Thomas's skim of the historical record, questioning his generalizations from a handful of archaic decisions. She also noted that Thomas declined to fully grapple with the countervailing evidence, citing old decisions that cut against his conclusory assertions. Clearly, Barrett is growing tired of her colleague's bogus originalism. She also criticized his highly selective frolic through the archives in last term's Samia versus U.S., questioning his reliance on a somewhat random snapshot of history to cut back protections of the Sixth Amendment. The court overclaims, the justice wrote then, risking undermining the force of the historical arguments when they matter the most. But this time, Barrett's critique cuts much deeper. Thomas, she wrote, never explains why hunting for historical forebears on a restriction-by-restriction basis is the right way to analyze the constitutional question. The majority presents tradition itself as the constitutional argument, as though it is dispositive of the First Amendment issue, without any theoretical justification. In a passage that must have made the liberal justices proud, Barrett continued, relying exclusively on history and tradition may seem like a way of avoiding judge-made tests, but a rule rendering tradition dispositive is itself a judge-made test, and I do not see a good reason to resolve this case using that approach rather than by adopting a generally applicable principle. Plucking out historical anecdotes, ad-libbing some connective tissue, and then presenting the results as a constitutional principle misses the forest for the trees. When applying broadly worded constitutional text, courts must inevitably articulate principles to resolve individual cases. This approach brings sorely needed clarity to the law. Barrett sketched out a better path, assessing the names clause within a framework grounded in both trademark law and First Amendment precedent. When the government opens its property to speech, she wrote, restrictions are permissible so long as they aren't cover for the official suppression of ideas. Thus, courts should uphold trademark laws if they are reasonable in light of the trademark system's purpose. Why did Barrett spill so much ink in repudiating Thomas's opinion when the two justices did, after all, land in the same place? Her opinion reads like a rebuttal of Bruin, Thomas's 2022 decision establishing a novel right to carry guns in public, which Barrett joined in full at the time, right? Bruin marked a sea change because it upended the way courts looked at firearms restrictions. Previously, the courts of appeal applied heightened scrutiny to gun laws, asking whether the regulation was carefully drawn to further public safety. SCOTUS applies this test in countless other contexts, including the First Amendment and equal protection cases. It requires judges to balance the interests of both sides, a well-worn tool of judicial review. Yet Thomas spurned this means-end scrutiny, demanding that courts rely exclusively on the nation's, quote, history and tradition. A gun restriction, he wrote, is only constitutional if it has a sufficient number of historical analogs from the distant past. I mean, that's just a made-up standard. It is. This brand new test has flummoxed the lower courts and led to ludicrous outcomes, partly because judges are not historians and have no reliable way to produce a complete historical record, and also because American society has evolved to the point that a great deal of tradition now looks barbaric. This term, the Supreme Court has been confronted with the fallout from Bruin in a follow-up called Rahimi, which asks whether domestic abusers have a right to bear arms. During oral arguments in Rahimi, Barrett sounded deeply uncomfortable with what her court had wrought. Rahimi has not yet been decided, but Barrett's concurrence in Elster reads like a preview of her opinion in that case. The justice seems to have second thoughts about pinning constitutional interpretation entirely on a court's amateur historical analysis. Good. She now seems to see the immense value in adopting a generally applicable principle that courts can apply across cases. The liberal justices were right there alongside Barrett and Elster, gladly signing on to her more sensible approach in that case. Justice Sonia Sotomayor, also wrote a separate concurrence raising many of Barrett's objections, taking more explicit aim at Bruin and the confusion it has caused, and some of Barrett's Elster concurrence echoes a recent opinion by Justice Elena Kagan, which Barrett notably joined, that offered an alternative to Thomas's rigid focus on founding-era history in a case upholding the constitutionality of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. This shadow boxing foreshadows, lots of shadows in this, a bitter split in Rahimi, though Barrett and the liberals appear poised to wind up on the winning side. There's no doubt that Barrett is still a Second Amendment enthusiast, but with one more vote, this bloc is well positioned to walk back the excesses of Bruin. What's certain right now is that the justice, at a minimum, has serious doubts about the legitimacy and workability of this Supreme Court's sloppy, results-oriented originalism. That doesn't mean Barrett has abandoned her broader commitment to the conservative legal movement's cause, but it does signal a disillusionment with conservative orthodoxies that could put her vote up for grabs in cases much more important than a trademark dispute. Very interesting. Something to keep an eye on. Ultimately, if part of her own ideology depends on adopting the Clarence Thomas historical review standard, she'll just go ahead and do it, I'm sure, for practical purposes. But yeah, she does appear to have been a much more serious scholar, let's say, than Clarence Thomas was. I don't know whether the case is, and actually don't know that I could say this broadly, whether he was one in law school, but certainly in the time since. He hasn't actually developed a sterling reputation as a scintillating legal scholar, though, look, the guy serves on the Supreme Court, so it matters what gets drafted for him and how, whether he has a real driving role in the drafting or not. But Amy Coney Barrett is something more of a traditional intellectual anyway, and has, rigorously been taught to rigorously back arguments with reasoning, not, well, I feel like nobody else has ever reasoned differently from this, and so therefore this must be the right thing. I could see it being a pet peeve. So interesting. And an interesting development for court watchers as well. And I know that will probably interest Joan to some extent. Speaking of Second Amendment stuff, maybe we can make this one long segment on the subject, because they did hint at what was disturbing, or the case that actually originally, I guess, unsettled Amy Coney Barrett, the Brewer case here. This is a piece in the New York Times that's published right alongside this, and I don't know whether it's coincidental or not, or this is something everybody's been talking about. This is rather lengthy, but let's see if we can't race through the meat of this. The gun lobby's hidden hand in the Second Amendment battle. It's not that hidden. And certainly we've pointed to it on the show, and it's been a pet peeve of Armando's for a long time. And I think probably among the final straws in convincing him that the court was just a results-oriented political operation. Going back at least as far, I guess, as the gun decision in Heller, when they just totally invented this idea of, personal, that there was a clear Second Amendment guarantee of the right to bear arms personally and individually, as opposed to as part of any well-regulated militia or potential militia member. Anyway, the gun lobby's hidden hand in the Second Amendment battle. Case after case challenging gun restrictions cites the same Georgetown professor. His seemingly independent work has undisclosed ties to pro-gun interests, and it should surprise no one, except it's disappointing. Mike McIntyre and Jody Cantor are the reporters on this. McIntyre apparently has been reporting on gun rights, with Jody Cantor, of course, covering the Supreme Court. They get together for this one, and it reads thus: in the battle to dismantle gun restrictions, raging in America's courts even as mass shootings become commonplace, one name keeps turning up in the legal briefs and judges' rulings: William English, Ph.D. And it's not the first time that they've repeatedly cited a study that was highly questionable. I'm thinking there have been examples in the past. What was it? I'm trying to recall which study, but it's similar in nature. But let's just focus on what they have and see whether maybe they remind us of the previous study at some point during the body of the article. A little-known political economist at Georgetown University, Dr. English, conducted a largest-of-its-kind national survey that found gun owners frequently used their weapons for self-defense, which immediately leads me to think, is this self-reporting? Because very often people have no idea what actually constitutes self-defense. very often they're quite wrong. And also sometimes they just make stuff up. Anyway, that finding has been deployed by gun rights activists to notch legal victories with far-reaching consequences, even if it isn't true. He has been cited in a landmark Supreme Court case that invalidated many restrictions on guns, and in scores of lawsuits around the country to overturn limits on assault weapons, high-capacity magazines, and the carrying of firearms. His findings were also offered in another Supreme Court case this term, with a decision expected this month. Okay. And I guess that's what we're looking at. Was it Rahimi case? Is that what was mentioned in the previous article? By the way, I think now it occurs to me, was it that study, I think, that I'm thinking of before that was highly questionable, that used to turn up in all the cases from John Lott? Is that the name I'm thinking of? Okay, well, we'll find out if it gets mentioned here. So, Dr. English seems, at first glance, to be an impartial researcher interested in data-driven insights. And maybe he really is, who knows. He has said his scholarly arc focuses on good public policy, and his lack of apparent ties to the gun lobby has lent credibility to his work. But Dr. English's interest in firearms is more than academic. He has received tens of thousands of dollars as a paid expert for gun rights advocates, and his survey work, which he says was part of a book project, originated as research for a National Rifle Association-backed lawsuit, the New York Times has found. He also has increasingly drawn scrutiny in some courts over the reliability and integrity of his unpublished survey, which is the core of his research, and his refusal to disclose who paid for it. Other researchers say that the wording of some questions could elicit answers overstating defensive gun use. I'm sure that's happening. And that he cherry-picked pro-gun responses. I have been struck by the enormous attention and influence the William English paper has had, said Joseph Blocher, B-L-O-C-H-E-R, co-director of the Center for Firearms Law at Duke University. It just sort of came out of nowhere. Posted online without going through formal peer review, and by a guy most of us had never heard of. Dr. English's National Firearms Survey has figured prominently in a broad gun rights campaign that has transformed the law. The effort is driven by litigation and sometimes questionable scholarship, backed with millions of dollars in dark money flowing through nonprofits that often only exist on paper. That might be a red flag in itself. The lofty-sounding Center for Human Liberty, for instance, created just in time to file a 2021 pro-gun Supreme Court brief jointly with Dr. English, has no staff, and uses a rent-by-the-hour office provider in Las Vegas. The Constitutional Defense Fund, with a UPS store in Virginia as its address, has served as a conduit for anonymous donations to Second Amendment groups, law firms, and Dr. English. The Firearms Policy Coalition, the busiest litigant of gun cases in the country, has made extensive use of Dr. English's survey, including introducing it in the Supreme Court case New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin, right? Same one we were just talking about. Dr. English's work was cited in multiple briefs in that case, as well as in oral arguments, and Justice Samuel Alito's concurring opinion, and I guess we have a screen grab of that here. The Bruin decision in 2022 upended Second Amendment law by sweeping away any modern-day gun restrictions that could not be tied to a historical antecedent. What happened to the old historical antecedents of Wild West towns that made you turn in your guns at the city line? Anyway, the ruling led to a surge in firearms cases to an annual average of 680 today, compared with 122 in the decade before. Okay, is that annual cases for the entire decade, or 122 over the decade? Pro-gun rulings have also risen. The 74 issued last year make up a quarter of all such rulings since 2000, according to researchers at the University of Southern California. Courts have struck down restrictions on high-capacity magazines in Oregon, handgun purchases in Maryland, and assault weapons in California. While expert research has always played a role in litigation. The demand for it in Second Amendment cases has risen since Bruin, sometimes testing the traditional standards of evidence and arguments in the nation's courts. A California judge upbraided gun rights plaintiffs in March for seeming to avoid having Dr. English testify about his survey, calling it a clear violation of the federal rules of evidence. In December, a judge in Colorado accused plaintiffs of trying to paper over another firearms expert's lack of qualifications. Appeals court judges for the Seventh Circuit in Chicago last year criticized pro-gun legal arguments by plaintiffs' counsel as illogical, unusual, and, quote, pretty weird. The Supreme Court itself is confronted with the consequences of its Bruin decision in the pending case of United States versus Rahimi, which considers whether guns can be denied to someone subject to a family violence protective order. The justices are expected to rule this month on whether the absence of such restrictions centuries ago, the test established in Bruin, invalidates them today. They didn't have, of course, family safety restraining orders back then. Among those filing briefs on the pro-gun side was Dr. English. He cited results of his online survey of gun owners to claim that, quote, guns save many lives each year. Well, let's see. Can I survey gun owners? They just sort of react, instinctively say that. And then you ask them for proof of it, and they say, anything from, I shot 1 million burglars just yesterday, to, well, people know I have a gun so they don't rob my house, so that's self-defense. Not really. And also, most people don't really have any effing idea what you have in there, even if you put stickers on the windows that say you have guns. The Times made multiple attempts to interview Dr. English, who teaches at Georgetown's business school, but he declined through a university spokesperson. He also did not respond to a list of questions. Government lawyers tried to talk with him in December after his research surfaced in a Firearms Policy Coalition lawsuit seeking to overturn Washington state's ban on assault weapons. But Dr. English did not respond to emails, phone calls, or a certified letter, and a process server bearing a subpoena could not find him at the university or his home, where someone inside looked at the door, then turned away. According to court records, faced with efforts to compel his testimony, the pro-gun plaintiffs in the Washington case chose to drop all references to his research. I mean, that's a fine way of getting his work dismissed. A quiet interest in guns is the next section. I guess that explains Dr. English's interest and background here. On his CV and on websites, there is no mention of guns among his many scholarly pursuits. That's interesting. He earned degrees in math, economics, and political science from Duke, and later studied ethics at Oxford. Before joining the Georgetown Business School faculty in 2016, Dr. English, now 43, was a humanities research fellow at Harvard. His academic focus has been ethical behavior and public policy. Among his research interests is how to lie with data science. In his few public comments about firearms, he says he got the idea for his national survey while working on a book. He told the Washington Examiner that it kind of dawned on me that there's a real opportunity here, just as a scholar, to contribute to this literature. And in a podcast for The Reload, a firearms news site, he said he had been thinking about this project in some ways for like 30 years. And he's 43. So I don't know what that says. But his interest in firearms goes beyond writing a book, which he has never published, by the way. Although it is not mentioned in his research papers or professional credentials, court records reveal that Dr. English served as an expert for pro-gun litigants in at least 4 lawsuits from 2018 to 2020, often charging $250 to $350 an hour. Dang, why am I not doing this? In a 2019 deposition in one case, Dr. English expressed a personal interest in guns that included sport shooting, hunting, and a lifetime NRA membership. Not unusual, really. He also said he had once brandished a gun to scare off an intruder at his home. That's the sort of thing that people will self-report as defensive gun use, even if they don't fire the weapon. And even if it doesn't happen, quite honestly. Anyway, he said in a deposition that without tenure, He was reluctant to go public with firearms research because it was a subject some people find controversial. Asked whether Georgetown administrators had questioned him about it, he said, "They don't know about my interests in that." They don't really need to either. In another case, plaintiff's lawyers asked him to survey Vermont gun owners. The lawsuit, backed by the NRA, challenged the state's ban on high-capacity magazines. The plaintiffs sought to show that such magazines are popular, meeting the Supreme Court's test of whether a firearm is in common use for lawful purposes, making it therefore harder to restrict. Dr. English, who testified that the plaintiff's lawyers paid him about $20,000 for his work, wrote a report in 2019 saying that an online questionnaire he devised showed that high-capacity magazines were popular among gun owners and useful for self-defense. The lawsuit was ultimately unsuccessful, but his survey would have far-reaching consequences. And here's some of what those consequences are before we exit. Dr. English's work emerged at what would be an opportune moment for gun rights advocates. The Supreme Court's balance shifted in 2018 with the arrival of Justice Brett Kavanaugh, a conservative who had established strong pro-gun credentials as an appellate judge. In the spring of 2020, he encouraged his colleagues to take on a case about how the Second Amendment applies outside the home. Writing a concurring opinion, as well as a more detailed memo to his colleagues, reviewed by the Times. In April of 2021, the court landed on Bruin, an NRA-backed challenge to a century-old New York law giving the state broad discretion over who could carry a handgun. That's a 100-year-old law. That's, got like some historical heft behind it. Apparently it didn't work. But by then, money was already pouring into gun rights organizations seeking to seize the moment. Much of it was untraceable, flowing through funds that served as pass-throughs for billions of dollars to tax-exempt organizations every year. One was Donors Trust, a so-called dark money group supporting conservative and libertarian causes. We've heard their name before. And let's delve into their background and further into what happens after this. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. We exited by just on the mention of Donors Trust having funded a lot of the litigation, the flood of pro-gun litigation that has resulted from these weird interpretations of historical fact, some of which has just been stood on its head, and pro-gun bent among the justices. And that Donors Trust was responsible for funding a lot of this, a so-called dark money group supporting conservative and libertarian causes. From 2020 to 2022, the group sent $11.8 million to the Constitutional Defense Fund, a pro-gun nonprofit whose website identifies none of its leaders and has a non-working email address. In other words, it's not a real thing. Tax filing, but it's got $12 million. Tax filings show that the fund dispersed almost all the money for Second Amendment defense, including $715,000 to the Firearms Policy Coalition, $90,000 to an NRA official, and $5.3 million to Cooper and Kirk, a law firm that has teamed up with both groups on gun cases and retained Dr. English in the Vermont lawsuit. Also listed on the defense fund's tax filings was $58,750 in grants to Dr. English at Georgetown. The university said it had no role, adding that faculty can conduct independent research projects. Amid the established Second Amendment groups and experts filing briefs supporting the plaintiffs in Bruin, Dr. English soon appeared with his own, prepared by a law firm paid by the Constitutional Defense Fund. He filed it with the Center for Human Liberty, that nonprofit created a couple of months before the Firearms Policy Coalition itself. So everything is sort of fly-by-night, and the night it flies by is the night before the deadline for filing in these cases. The coalition is a scrappy and aggressive litigation group whose leader, Brandon Combs, once suggested that an assault weapons ban would lead to, quote, armed resistance. Well, it would be less armed if it was banned. Anyway, it has appeared in more court cases in recent years than the NRA, which is bankrupt now, of course, including through a legal brief cited in last week's Supreme Court decision overturning a ban on bump stocks. So they're getting things done. They shouldn't be, but they are. Many of the coalition's efforts involve, of course, Dr. English's work. Dr. English's 2021 brief in the Bruin case debuted his National Firearms Survey, one of 2 gun studies he had posted just days earlier on the Social Science Research Network site, where virtually anyone can upload unpublished academic papers. In its introduction, he mentioned the Vermont survey, calling it a pilot that served as a proof of concept for the national version, but he described it simply as part of a research project. He did not say that it arose out of expert witness work in a pro-gun lawsuit, nor how the national survey was paid for, a standard disclosure in academic research. But of course, that would have been found out by any journal he was publishing in, but he just went around the journal thing and published on a website. Scholarly sounding, but not peer-reviewed. In Dr. English's findings, roughly 1/3 of 16,708 gun owners responded to an online questionnaire that they had used a firearm in self-defense. 30% reported having owned an AR-15 style rifle, and 48% said they had owned magazines holding more than 10 rounds. Together with the other paper he posted asserting that carrying firearms in public did not increase crime, his work buttressed the pro-gun position in the Bruin case. Now, what about this survey? Dr. English extrapolated from the survey responses that guns are used in self-defense 1.67 million times a year, a high figure that has resonated in the courts. A federal judge last year cited it as he invalidated California's assault weapons ban. So it's very much like the John Lott gun self-defense thing. It basically is a good parallel to the inherent contempt work here. It's already been done, but it's been a while, and the next generation of expert witnesses has already forgotten about it or maybe never even discovered it and is doing the work all over again. And why not? I mean, they're getting paid pretty well for it. I didn't. Walter's making a living. That's good. But they're not getting paid in the millions, as is the case with some of these guys. Anyway, yeah, it's interesting because, I mean, as I recall, John Lott's study was pretty much used in exactly the same way, and it also had an outlandishly high figure that made people think or wonder, what do people think defensive gun use is exactly? Anyway, some experts consider it to be vastly overstated in its conclusions. In 2018, the Rand Corporation analyzed the similar claim from a 1990s study widely cited by gun rights activists and concluded it was not plausible. Other estimates range widely, not wildly, but that's probably the case too, with several putting the annual number below 100,000. It's still a lot, but it's not 1.6 million. There's a link here to the Rand Corporation thing, and I think if I click on it, it'll probably tell me exactly what I was looking for before. Does it cite which study they were looking at? Any place easy? I don't know. Well, there's definitely one of them. Oh, yeah, I forgot about this one. CLEC. The CLEC study was another similar one that overstated defensive gun use. And I was pretty sure that John Lott was involved in another of them, but maybe not. Or at least maybe this wasn't the one they were looking at. But CLEC definitely rings a bell from my days having watched gun issues much more closely. And in early days of social media, when we were talking about gun fail ideas and happenings, that was the sort of thing that the gun enthusiasts came back with all the time. CLEC says, this study by CLEC says that there was DGU, defensive gun use, just everywhere. It was happening all the time. And he, too, surveyed, some limited number of gun owners and then extrapolated. So a third of the 5,000 people I talked to said that they used their guns defensively in the last year. There are this many guns in the United States. Therefore, based on that, 1/3 of them were defensively used, even though, I don't know whether he actually even bothered to separate between the number of guns in circulation versus the number of gun owners, because multiple gun owners, should count once. You can only use a gun defensively as a person in one end. You can do it repeatedly, but you're only one person. If you have 500 guns and you use one of them defensively, that's not 500 defensive gun uses. Anyway, I thought it might be referring back to John Lott. Now I have to look up exactly what was it that John Lott was famous for falsifying in his research. I can't remember, but it's the impression that was left with me. But here, I'll take a look over in Wikipedia and see if I can't figure it out here. He too, an economist and gun rights advocate for some strange reason. Academic career, research on guns, concealed weapons and crime rates, defensive gun use. He definitely did do a defensive gun use study in 1998. In 2002, he said that brandishing a weapon was sufficient to stop an attack 95% of the time. Not really sure where that came from. And then on again into the 2000s. A disputed survey is listed here. Lott claimed to have undertaken a national survey of 2,424 respondents in 1997, the results of which were the source for the claims that he had been making since 1997. I guess, yes, also about defensive gun use. So, it's a repeated pattern. Basically, Dr. English just found a way to monetize redoing and updating, I guess. If you're tired of referring to these old studies from the 90s, particularly if you're worried that too many people have heard that it was discredited, I'll just use the same discredited methodology to produce a new study that hasn't yet been discredited, and you can use that for $250 an hour. Anyway, the professor's definition of self-defense was broad, similar to the previous studies, I'm sure. Almost a third of those who answered yes on the survey said they may have, quote, verbally told someone they had a gun without showing one. In addition, the survey asked people if they had defended themselves with a gun ever in their lifetime, rather than during a defined period. So who knows? And dreams might count, and God only knows what goes into that survey. But yeah, by the way, I might have verbally told someone. But of course, and I mean, I get the point. Well, you see, it's the threat of a gun that did it. And of course, the threat is credible only because the courts are allowing us to be carrying guns individually on the street, concealed, and there doesn't... Everybody will know, all the street criminals will know that it's not very difficult to jump through the hoops necessary, or sometimes there's no hoops at all with constitutional carry, no permits necessary. You can just have guns anywhere. So everyone should believe that everyone else's gun is armed at all times. And of course, that only leads us to the fantastic anecdote of, well, an armed society is a polite society. Of course, society doesn't, by no one's measure is society getting any more polite. Let's say that. I think we can probably reach that conclusion, whether or not you blame it on the guns. But yeah, interesting. So they're like, well, as long as it's plausible that anybody could have a gun, then just saying you have a gun is enough. And that just proves how powerful it is to allow guns to be widely circulated this way. On the other hand, it also proves that you don't actually have to have a gun. All there has to be is the realistic possibility that you do. So therefore, it's not actually all that important that you be allowed to carry it around, since you can just say, I have a gun. But, it may just happen that some criminals demand proof. Anyway, like the Supreme Court. They demand proof sometimes too, but sometimes not. Anyway, moving on. Dr. Matthew Miller, part of a team at Northeastern and Harvard universities that for years has conducted its own firearms survey, said some of Dr. English's findings of self-defense strain credulity, and his methodology yielded absurd estimates. Another researcher, Louis Claravas, of Columbia University, has criticized Dr. English's work in expert reports for states defending against gun lawsuits, and said he has not followed standard ethics practices for revealing funding sources, which is weird because he studied ethics at Oxford. Disclosing survey sponsorship is vital to assuring that the survey was not designed or conducted to further the political or economic interests of particular entities. Dr. Claravas wrote last month in an Illinois case, although honestly, you could have written that yourself because you know that that's the standard. Other issues have also been raised. Dr. English did not detail how the online respondents were chosen or why they are representative of the country. And an examination of the raw data reveals that in reporting results, he omitted prefaces to survey questions, whose wording, according to some polling experts, essentially invited respondents to rebut supposed misconceptions about guns. So sometimes that leads to a little storytelling. Here's an example of that missing context. Let's take a look at this here. There's a couple of screen grabs that read, defensive use of firearms was assessed through a series of questions that asked for increasingly detailed information from those who indicated that they had used a firearm in self-defense. First, all gun owners were asked, have you ever defended yourself or your property with a firearm, even if it was not fired or displayed? Please do not include military service, police work, or work as a security guard. Although, again, that still leads people to say, well, I had a gun at my house and I was never robbed. I consider myself to have been defending my property all of that time, but nobody ever came to take any of my property. Maybe because they knew I had a gun. I don't know. Anyway, about a third answered in the affirmative, and they were then asked how many times they defended themselves with a firearm, from once to 5 or more times. As figure 2 shows, a majority of gun owners who have used a firearm to defend themselves have done so on more than one occasion. The paper quotes a survey question, omitting the setup to it, which is highlighted down below in blue, and it says many policy, I guess this is a thing that they then prompted people with before they asked them, so have you ever used a gun in self-defense? Many policymakers recognize that a large number of people participate in shooting sports, but question how often guns are used for self-defense. Have you ever defended yourself or your property with a firearm, even if it was not fired or displayed? So a little bit of prodding there in that one. Other questions followed the same pattern of omission. This one about AR-15 style rifles included text before and after the question in the version respondents saw, but not in the paper. The paper says, well, the question was, have you ever owned an AR-15 or similarly styled rifle? You can include any rifles of this style that have been modified or moved to be compliant with local law. But as it turns out, the people who were being asked the question were first confronted with this. Some have argued that few gun owners actually want or use guns that are commonly classified as, quote, assault weapons. Have you ever owned an AR-15 or similarly styled rifle? Answering this will help us establish how popular these types of firearms are. Oh, okay. I definitely want them to appear popular. And, of course, that could be either the respondents who don't really know the reason why they want them to appear popular, but like the idea of being among or having many others, supporters who, like them, think it's important to have an AR-15. Or they may have understood from Dr. English at some other point that, yes, we're trying to establish how popular they are so that we can sue to make it harder to restrict them. Courts are loath to restrict access to weapons that are thought to be widely in circulation already and very popular among gun owners. So an affirmative answer here helps us out. Okay, well then I will give you one. Elsewhere in his findings, Dr. English quotes about 30 gun owners attesting to the usefulness of large capacity magazines for self-defense, but only 2 reported actually firing a gun, both at animals. He did not quote any of the hundreds of negative responses from gun owners, by the way, including, there is no reason to have a magazine like that unless you're fighting in a war. But somehow that didn't make it in there. But now a turning point. During oral arguments in Bruin, after Justice Stephen Breyer worried that creating a sweeping right to carry firearms in public could increase deaths of innocent people, the lead plaintiff's lawyer, Paul Clement, a former U.S. Solicitor General, referred him to Dr. English's work as a counterpoint. The English brief, I think, is really worth taking a look at. It's a little evocative of Donald Trump there. If you take a look at it, that's a tell for Trump. He's telling you a lie about something. I don't know if it's the same for Paul Clement, but just putting that out there. There is no suggestion that Dr. English's work alone tipped the balance in the justices' deliberations, which included input from many experts and legal scholars. But his credentials and findings carried weight. At least 5 briefs cited his research. The draft opinion that Justice Clarence Thomas circulated to his colleagues in February of 2022 was sweeping, with the potential to outlaw many common gun control measures. The majority was slow to sign on. Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Kavanaugh requested modifications, according to people familiar with the deliberations, who requested anonymity because that process is intended to be secret. That would be clerks. By May, Justice Thomas still had not mustered the 5 votes needed. Mass shootings that month in Buffalo and Uvalde galvanized public attention anew on gun violence. Then they needed to delay things so that things could simmer down before they issued their ruling. It was not until June that his opinion prevailed, when Justice Kavanaugh signed on but wrote his own more moderate concurrence, joined by the Chief. Justice Alito's concurrence went the other way, dismissing the significance of the Buffalo shooting, noting the New York law being overturned did not prevent it, and faulting Justice Breyer for focusing only on research that concluded more guns in public contributed to more crime. There are other studies, Justice Alito said, that suggest the opposite. For instance, see the brief for William English et al., he wrote. What a surprise. That's where they're turning. And as it turns out, none of the usual scholastic rigor involved in this. And, of course, it just reproduces the dumb studies produced by others, Lott, Kleck, etc., in years past that have been discredited over time, but they just wanted the same conclusions rewritten with other names involved so that it would take another 20 years to figure out that this study, too, was unhelpful and poorly conducted and probably resulted in policy that, one is a poor idea, and 2 is not founded by expert research at all. And I mean, really, how expert is expert research? I mean, it's great to be an economist, and some of the things that they do in the modeling and the mathematics behind their work is sometimes, it certainly looks impressive. It's difficult. It's got all sorts of squigglies in it and stuff, and you can't understand it. Well, we got one member of the household who can understand these things, but I can't. But, it's not difficult to grasp that at bottom, if you ask people, have you ever used a gun defensively? And that could mean anything. And they'll say, and it's good for gun owners if you say yes, then they'll say yes. And they'll either make up a story, or if you entitle them to say, yeah, it's defensive gun use for you to keep a gun at home. And if people have not robbed you, then you've been defending your property with a gun. No one has showed up, but you were there to defend it. So that's defensive gun use. Okay, well, if I can get a third of you to say that, by the way, that means 2/3 of people say, no, my gun sits there and does nothing the whole time. I'm waiting still for my chance to be Rambo and possibly shoot myself while cleaning the gun while waiting. But if 1/3 of you have done it, then 1/3 of everybody has done it. And how many gun owners are there? And so therefore, and no, it doesn't really work like that, especially if the definition of defensive gun use is so loose. Okay, time to shift topics at this point and set things up for discussion with Joan. I mentioned to you that there's this burgeoning disarray motif happening among Republicans, and there's a couple of different interesting reports on it. Let's take a look at, what's going on here today. Today is Tuesday, which means not only that Joan is coming, but that it is primary day. And primary day, of course, the last day to vote now that they open voting so early, and it includes here in Virginia. So I got 2 stories here that, outside of what Joan has written, that hint at a broader pattern, one from Virginia and one from Indiana, in which, the complications of coalitional politics gets magnified 100 times by including in your coalition Donald Trump or anyone near him. And here's what I mean. It's difficult enough to navigate the complexities of coalition politics. But if you add somebody who's got no real logic to his decision making and basically conducts himself as a child, you will end up tied up in knots trying to figure out what's going on. Here's an example. As one example, I offer you something from The Hill by Emily Brooks and Julia Manchester, writing about one of the primaries here in Virginia. Trump clashes with allies in Bob Good's bitter Virginia primary. Here's the deal. Representative Bob Good and his Tuesday primary in Virginia's 5th congressional district is pitting a former President Trump against some of his top allies and inflaming bitter ideological tensions in the House GOP, or GOP as we like to call it. The contentious race could result in the first House incumbent primary loss of 2024 and the first success for former Speaker Kevin McCarthy's revenge campaigns against those who voted to oust him. The problem we have here is two competing revenge campaigns. Well, first of all, the fact that there is such a thing as a revenge campaign, and not just one but two, and that we can't figure out what the dynamics of either of them are because they don't make any underlying sense. It's really something like, who's getting revenge here if Bob Good loses? Trump endorsed Good's opponent. McCarthy endorsed Good's opponent. If Good's opponent wins, both Trump and McCarthy will be able to have claimed revenge. But about what, for one thing, and are they right, and does it matter? And given that Bob Good still considers himself a staunch Trump supporter, why is it revenge for Trump if he displaces him? I don't really know if we'll ever be able to straighten that out. Well, let's read on. Trump last month endorsed Good's challenger, John McGuire, a Virginia state senator and Navy SEAL, in an apparent act of revenge, although the revenge is not apparent to me. Good is the chair of the House Freedom Caucus, the hardline conservative group that has often been aligned with the former president, but he was one of a handful of House Republicans to endorse Florida Governor Ron DeSantis for president in the Gop primary. Okay, that's the revenge. Even though Good avoided criticism of Trump and swiftly endorsed the former president after DeSantis dropped out, Trump said the endorsement was too late. So he's very mad at Good for endorsing DeSantis. So he endorsed his opponent, which is interesting because Kevin McCarthy also endorsed his opponent because he's mad at Good for voting to oust him from the speaker's chair, which is interesting because, well, let's see. In this case, Trump said that Trump discouraged the idea of vacating the speakership. I can't even remember what he decided. Anyway, I guess it doesn't even enter into it. Doesn't matter. Too late, says Trump. The damage has been done, and if only there was damage. McGuire is also being boosted by Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, who last year parted ways with the Freedom Caucus. So she's mad at Good because he's with the Freedom Caucus, and they kicked her out. So she backs McGuire. After the tense clashes with the others in the group, she has consistently criticized Good. But, of course, she was pro-McCarthy in that motion to vacate the speakership. So if she's pro-McCarthy, McCarthy also backs McGuire, so that's going to lead her to, okay, that one works out. But many of Trump's other staunch defenders in Congress are backing the second-term Virginia Republican, that is to say, Good, including Matt Gaetz and Byron Donalds, a reported contender to be Trump's running mate. So how do you explain that one? I mean, I don't think it's really going to happen, but Trump backs McGuire and his running mate, let's say, backs Good. How interesting. Good this week brushed off questions about whether he regretted endorsing DeSantis. Everyone should, but he says, it's time to come behind President Trump. I'm not focused on an endorsement from 13 months ago. So, what does that tell you? It's going to be close anytime you have a former president coming out against you. I think meritless. He got some bad advice. Chip Roy. said of the Trump endorsement. Roy is Freedom Caucus member, of course, who's backing good and who also supported DeSantis. And so now I guess the question is, did Trump at any point seek or endorse a primary challenger to Chip Roy? I don't know. It's inconsistent across the board. Anyway, it's happening everywhere. The story I didn't get to is a story from the New York Times, Michelle Goldberg, an opinion piece, of course, but entitled, "In Indiana, the MAGA Revolution Eats Its Own." What's that about? It's about the Indiana governor's race, where Senator Mike Braun is running for governor there, and I guess there's trouble in paradise there as well. Real divisions. Hi everybody, it's me, David Waldman. Yes, the same guy who interrupts you all the time. Interrupting you one more time, just to tell you again, another reminder that your contributions are what keep this show on the air, and patreon.com, patreon.com, is still among the easiest ways to make the sustaining subscription donations that keep us afloat. Are you ready for the pep talk about how our Patreon campaign is still going strong and growing? Well, too bad. Yeah, the plain fact is we actually are headed in the wrong direction, and whereas we once had about 175 monthly patrons, we're now actually down below 150. Time to recruit some more. Not exactly the kind of news I wanted to share, but there it is. For those of you in a position to support the show, patreon.com does make it easy to make those secure, recurring monthly contributions to do so. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. We've been through a lot together. The worst of the pandemic, we hope. The worst of the insurrection, we hope. So go ahead and treat yourself. You don't need an excuse. Give yourself the gift of a little something you enjoy in life. Support the show. And of course, if you happen to prefer using PayPal or even the Square Cash app, we're up and running on those options too. So thanks again, everyone, for all your support. We couldn't, or at least shouldn't, do it without you. Hope you'll be on board soon too. Thanks for all your support. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. We should have continued our conversation. Joan McCarter is here. I told her I had been reading, I guess, her latest, the latest post about, again, internal Republican civil war. This one on a slightly different front, but all of these things seem to have the same inscrutable dynamics, and it basically comes down to Trump hates everybody, generally speaking, and everybody in the Republican Party has given him reason to like them, and hate them. And I guess it's a question of who reaches him last before he issues an endorsement. And he's very frequently endorsed people who are challengers to people he's had trouble with, but it turns out that the person he's endorsed is worse, either on that subject or on some other subject in terms of agreeing with Trump. You have people who swear they're loyal to Trump to the last drop of their blood, who have endorsed the wrong primary candidate for whatever reason and find themselves in opposition to Trump. People who depart from Trump with respect to whether or not they should be vacating the speakership the first time, the second time, the third time. I don't know. Murdery Trader Green all over the map on these things. But just reading about what was going on in Virginia in the Bob Good race and who's taking what sides, and finding out for the first time that Kevin McCarthy also has a revenge tour going on, just as Donald Trump does. We didn't even get to the Indiana story where Senator Brown, it says Brown, but it's spelled Braun, is running for governor of Indiana and apparently has had a lieutenant governor running mate imposed on him by the state party. He had a hand-picked running mate in mind, and the party said, no, we're giving you a different person who's more MAGA-oriented and combative, and we want that person to be, I guess, your anointed successor. And he's finding out for the first time, oh, I don't actually have any control over this. This is really weird. So that's another internal battle. And then Joan McCarter, as I said, is here. We're going to let her speak now. It's time for her to chime in. And as I said, the last thing I read from you is the House Speaker Mike Johnson sets off new, I love to say, Gop civil war. And this one we've heard about as well. This has to do with the new placements on the Intelligence Committee. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Kind of an important committee, kind of a sensitive committee.
Right.
And he decided to put on insurrectionist Scott Perry and wacko Trump Dr. Ronny Jackson, or Ronny Johnson as Trump calls him.
All right. He told me I could call him either one. And he might have actually said that, too. He's the kind of person, you can call me anything you want, Mr. President.
Oh, I'm sure he would say that.
Yeah. So Ronny Johnson Jackson, drinky motion, as we say his name, who, has no business. His problem is he doesn't qualify as under the intelligence part. And Scott Perry doesn't qualify in you're supposed to keep this stuff secret. And you're not supposed to be, on the enemy team when we share these national security secrets for you. So, how does this spark a civil war, though?
These two are going to be hearing national security.
Yeah, bad news all on its own.
Secrets. Because, for no other reason, Trump was the one who wanted them on this committee. So clearly they are going to be there to be his moles. Mm-hmm.
And interestingly, again, you sort of find out how little power comes with things. Sometimes peers, I'm going to say poor Senator Brown, who I feel no compassion for whatsoever, finding out, I'm the senator from Indiana. I'm now the nominee for governor, and I still have no power to even determine who's going to run with me on the ticket. MAGA takes over, and here, Mike Johnson, I'm the Speaker of the House, but as it turns out, I have no power over who I am supposed to put on a very important national security position. Donald Trump
I have to do what Trump asks. Well, and this is the problem for another supposed powerhouse in the House, Mike Turner, who is chair of the Intelligence Committee.
Apparently that means
because Johnson didn't even consult with him before putting these two on his committee.
Yeah, interesting.
And I believe he is big mad about that. He hasn't given any direct quotes, but other members of the committee, without giving their names, have told the press that the whole committee's enraged by this.
I can see why that would be the case, and now that as you're describing it, I can see why Mike Johnson would do such a thing. Ordinarily, you would say, "That's terrible. You don't do that. Be a human. Talk to your colleagues." But he was probably felt so put upon and belittled by Trump that he felt like he needed to put upon and belittle someone else. So he made Mike Turner his target. I'll beat you up, and then I'm still a tough guy. I'm still powerful. I can make this happen, even though it wasn't my idea, and I was ordered to do it by an idiot. But,
Even Kevin McCarthy didn't play games with this committee. Even McCarthy worked with Jeffries to determine the membership of this committee because it's not a standing committee. So it's not, this is one where the leaders decide who's there.
Okay.
And so McCarthy didn't want this one politicized. He possibly recognized the value of not having Trump's sycophants on it. Maybe he recognized that there is a national security issue involved here.
Yeah, I don't know. There was once a time, I guess, when he came up in an era when there were still Republicans who said stuff like, well, national security and intelligence, we got to work with Democrats a little bit on that one. We're less outspokenly partisan about our operations on this committee. And he took it seriously. And then, of course, he was chucked out. And so now he just takes nothing seriously, I guess. But
except his revenge against Matt Gaetz.
Yeah, although he's getting nowhere with that. So he probably should learn soon enough that, maybe I shouldn't take this seriously either.
According to Matt Gaetz, and we haven't seen outside confirmation of this, there is a new ethics probe against him.
Oh.
But according to Matt Gaetz, there are 4 others. I think he says there are 4 other probes that the ethics committee has closed. which also no one has confirmed. We don't know how many investigations there are, and we don't know how many.
Wow.
The
That's
Justice
weird.
Department investigation against Gates is closed, but the Ethics Committee has been continuing with it, and this is just Gates' word.
Yeah, that might be
A
nothing.
normal member of Congress would not really want to amplify the fact that
Right. Yeah, like
he's big and under investigation.
much less
But
that he's been under 4 of them.
Gates is not normal.
Yeah, and he may
And
not
he's
have
still
been under
blaming it
4.
on Kevin McCarthy.
Yeah. Well, it leads to some weird situations. As I was reading about the Virginia situation, people are putting themselves on opposite sides of this good McGuire primary, and it's odd and it's impossible to predict based on the public affinities where people will land. You have both people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Matt Gaetz, both of whom say they're absolutely 100% devoted to Donald Trump and will follow him anywhere. But, Trump has to pick one side or the other. Well, he doesn't have to, but he has chosen to choose one side. And if you find yourself landing on the other side in the primary, it's interesting to see them trying to justify, well, why am I standing against Trump? Except, no one is interested in actually asking them that question. But
No.
it's weird. You could certainly be confronted that way. And I'm sure at some party function later on, you'll be accused of, you opposed Trump. How dare you? But everybody can point to one or another of these primaries where they've opposed the person chosen sometimes at random for no particular reason by Trump. And it's sometimes nothing more than the day before I made the decision, he said a nice thing about me, so I'm endorsing that person. It turns out, he's a mass murderer. Oh, well, whatever. It doesn't matter. It wasn't. I'm sure it was justified. And
Bob Good's offense, if I remember correctly,
it's hard to
was
describe.
Endorsing DeSantis?
Yes, that's the crime. And when DeSantis dropped out, he immediately endorsed Trump. And Trump, amazingly, just totally unheard of in politics in general. At this point, running for president, it's a 10,000 way primary. The guy drops out, and you pick up his endorsements. You usually say, it's time for unity and to move forward together. And he says, nope, too late. The damage has been done. Of course, also ordinarily your communications director says, don't say that damage has been done. Even though it's not true, don't say the damage has been done, because why do we want to admit that we were damaged by this idiot? Don't say that. Shut up. I'm throwing ketchup at the wall. I want to say the damage has been done. And he's mad. He's hugely mad that a guy endorsed DeSantis and never said anything bad about Trump. Just said, I don't know, I like DeSantis. I like his boots. I don't know what the reason is. But now he's out, Meatball Ron is gone, and I'm endorsing you. No, I'm not going to accept it. I'm not going to accept it. And instead, I'm going to endorse your primary challenger, about whom I'm sure he knows next to nothing.
I know next to nothing. Yeah. What do you know about McGuire?
He's a Navy SEAL, like 10 billion other candidates. And we've had such great... Republicans are doing great with their Navy SEAL nominees, by the way. They're all upstanding people, and none of them have been thrown out of the governorship for raping people at all. So don't even look, everybody, because you won't find any evidence of that happening. Nobody's tying up any people in their basement.
I am kind of concerned about the Navy SEAL program.
Yeah.
Tim Sheehy, the implant from, where is he from? Minnesota? In Montana?
Okay.
He's a Navy SEAL. And he's also a pathological liar, apparently.
Yeah, well, they may be wrecking those guys with what we ask them to do. They may also be self-selecting.
Maybe something happens to them.
Yeah,
down deep underwater. Some kind of physiological change.
That could be it.
Them into...
Could be. Yeah, there's some. It's some sort of nitrogen bubbles are doing this stuff that in the blood. That and anyway, it's not like they've been distinguishing themselves as fantastic people across the board. That's certainly not the case. But it's big bragging rights, and people love it for whatever reason. But that's all we know. All I know, anyway, about McGuire, and that I guess he'll be a Trump loyalist. But I mean, so would Bob Good, so I don't know what to tell you.
Right. And this must be very frustrating for the rest of the Freedom Caucus.
Yeah, I mean...
Since he is their chair.
Right. What do you have to do to prove yourself to Trump and how easily he can be dissuaded? Of course, I'm sure McGuire will join the Freedom Caucus and has probably already promised to do so if elected.
Yes.
So, that is... It's just, I don't know. This has got to be disturbing for all of them. But I'm sure it falls right in line with Trump's strategy. You know, they should always freak out about thinking about stepping out of line.
Yes.
And if you don't know who, if it's okay to endorse somebody else early in the primary, check with me. I will tell you it's not. Very bizarre.
That's how autocracies work.
Yeah. So... unusual to say the least. Unusual also that Kevin McCarthy's revenge. I'm not certain who he should be targeting for his revenge. Obviously, he's out for revenge against people who voted to vacate the speakership. Mm-hmm. So
he really, really failed with Nancy Mace.
Yeah. So that's kind of embarrassing. I guess he's looking for a McGuire win here to show that he's got some juice, but who cares? I mean, he's not in politics anymore.
I know. What Kevin McCarthy is trying to achieve with this, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Other than just, he's a bitter person and he's driven by that.
I can understand his being embittered, but I mean, he should just, you know what? Here's the model, Boehner. Finally, do what John Boehner did. You drink some wine, maybe get into cannabis for all I care. I don't know. You're from California. That's popular, I understand, and go for it. But no, he's decided to hang around and be bitter, and he's decided that it should be labeled revenge, which just puts him in competition with Trump in a way. And Trump is going, no, I'm the original revenge. You need to pick a different word, Kevin. I care more about revenge than you. How about that? And
it's very strange. He could be off making a lot of money somewhere.
Yeah.
Like he did when he was speaker.
Yes. And instead he's just burning money. I think he spent like $10,000 on the Mace primary and lost it. It's not his money, but I mean, you don't want to look that bad. But, all right. He's got a pack to empty out, I guess. And, there's another thing, right? Okay. So Boehner drinks wine and mows the lawn and is loving it. And you could spend all your leftover PAC and leadership money on Arby's and Starbucks, like Rick Santorum. There's no shortage of models of what to do when you're unceremoniously booted from power, even if that was unprecedented. And yet, he can't figure out what to do. Oh, well, that seems pretty odd. But that's where we are. And yes, a multi-front, ongoing, completely inscrutable Republican civil war, always and at all times over everything. That seems like it would be difficult to compete as a national party in the face of something like that. But
yes, it does.
Here we are.
And here we are because it's Trump.
Yes.
And, the absurdity is that it's Trump.
Yeah.
He's, a liar, a racist. He's physically vulgar. He's obviously losing his marbles.
Oh, boy, yeah.
It's stepping out of it. The rest of the world must be looking at this and thinking, what the...
Yeah, really.
You saw what happened the first time around America. Really? Yeah. You're thinking about doing it again?
I guess it would be very convincing to the observers around the world of the idea that there was, Russian active measures involved. Like, I wasn't so sure about it the first time, but now that they're trying it, that Americans might actually do this again, even in the face of, yes, I'm going to destroy democracy and end the Constitution. Who would be celebrating that? Well, I guess maybe there's something to it after all. That would be very exciting, I would think. An exciting development in Russia. But meanwhile, I guess this being the case, and Republicans being, as a result of it, I guess, or at least in part as a result, unable to govern. Not only do they just have too small a majority, but can't unify it and have no hope of doing so, since battle lines are drawn 6 different directions with no meaning or unifying theme among them, so that you can't tell which side you're supposed to join in the 6-way civil war. I guess all the legislating is being done by their Supreme Court justices instead, which I'm sure is also much on their mind.
They're making motions at legislating. They passed the National Defense Authorization for next year last week. Again, larding it up with lots of poison pill cultural war amendments that are not going to pass in the Senate. Mm-hmm. It's the exact replay of what we've seen since McCarthy got in. So they can't even learn. Or don't care to.
I guess.
They want to have this fight.
Yeah. I guess what they've learned is you can pull this stunt, and if you're worried about the national security implications, the Senate will save you. And then you can yell about them and say, the liberals undid all my culture war stuff, but, here's money for the armed forces. And things go on. And then next year you get to have the same fight. But, of course, you have a House contingent who got those things into the bill who are saying, no, we'll shut down the government if you don't make sure it's included. We will have a motion to vacate against you, Mike Johnson, if you don't force the Senate to keep it in there. So I suppose that's the thing.
And then you come back to Mike Johnson putting Scott Perry and Ronny Jackson on the Intelligence Committee, and you've got the rest of the Republicans saying, why are you rewarding these people?
Yeah.
Why are we not fighting back against these people?
These are the guys that are more likely than any to try and unseat you. So, why would you, why give them what they want? Yeah, I'm not sure. By the way, do you remember what was did Trump take a position on McCarthy's ouster? Did he just sort of reluctantly say, yeah, we shouldn't do this? Was he convinced of that?
I think that was it, yeah. He was not gung-ho on doing it because I don't know, he thought it made Republicans look bad, but he thought it made him look bad. He doesn't care about how Republicans look.
I can't even remember.
I don't remember him being adamantly opposed.
Yeah, not my recollection either, which now that I think about it is like, how could that be the case? That they were going to vacate the speakership and the former president who's running for re-election in that party, what position did he take on that? No one remembers? That's weird. Well, because the only thing that's serious to him is, of course, his positions about himself. He doesn't take positions on anybody else except as a favor to cash in later. I will give you an endorsement, and then, by the way, you're supposed to kick some percentage of your fundraising back to me if I do that. And even that isn't really a political endorsement. It's just a business arrangement, a transaction.
Exactly. And he did tell Marjorie Taylor Greene, supposedly, to lay off Johnson.
Yes.
We know that.
I don't know why, though. I'm not sure what it wasn't because we need to stabilize things and reunify the party, or is it Johnson is kicking money up to me, or it's hard for me to raise money in an atmosphere where this is happening all the time, or what? I don't know. But yeah, and yet also, I'm also thinking of Taylor's own, Marjorie Taylor Greene's own record in the motions to vacate, where you would have thought that would be something she would have jumped on immediately in the McCarthy thing. But of course, McCarthy maybe this is what motivates Mike Johnson.
She and McCarthy were great buddies.
Yeah, because he rewarded her petulance with some plum assignments as well. And maybe Mike Johnson is thinking the same play with these two idiots that he put on the Intelligence Committee. Plus, of course, he was ordered to do so by Trump, so he can hardly say no.
That's all.
Yeah,
Trump told him to do it, so he did it.
That's pretty amazing all by itself. I wonder whether he even thought, well, maybe they'll oppose, now that Marjorie Taylor Greene has seen, you can become famous doing this. Gates did it, and he's dumb, so I can do it too. I'm also dumb, so I can totally make this
possible.
work.
They are the two biggest attention seekers in the House,
which is difficult to determine.
Yes,
quite honestly,
I think you could say Gates and Green are at the top.
Yeah, you think so. And there's other people, I guess, are discovering that they might be able to make plays for it, but there's something to be said for being the original gangster.
In her Scarlet Letter, Luna. Florida's Anna Paulina Luna and her.
Yeah.
Supposedly she's getting a vote on it. Her resolution to have the Sergeant at Arms arrest Merrick Garland.
Yeah, fun. I like it. Let's do it.
And then.
Is there another?
What?
Yeah, no, she's certainly vying for it. I don't know. I mean, no one has ever known. But it was interesting, to read that report up on the front page, and also seeing not only how it was handled, but then reaction to it, and saying, Anna Paulina Luna, she's crazy, et cetera, et cetera. Well, yes, but, inherent contempt is a real thing. I mean, it's true that it isn't frequently used and hasn't been used for 75 plus years, but it does exist.
In this case.
Right. And there's all sorts of reasons why it doesn't make a good application of inherent contempt. But if the House says it's doing it, it's doing it. Now the question is, how do you get in to the DOJ to arrest Garland, even if the Sergeant at Arms says, this is crazy, but yes, I'll do it. Which, they might find some way of begging off on this thing or saying, well, where would we put him afterwards? And I mean, we've been through this and thinking about utilizing the procedure on others in the past. Just whenever the executive branch refuses to comply with subpoenas, you wonder, all right, well, what's our real power here? And ultimately, it's like with most things, there's one gigantic nuclear option to be used, and it's designed that way so that you say it's going to really have to be worth it in order to drop this bomb, because who knows what happens after this. But then you turn over the House to crazies and idiots, the bomb's still there.
Yes.
And you had to give the codes to those guys. And now, of course, you have put two more of their idiots on the Gang of Eight. So, that's a really huge national security problem, and it's difficult to explain how troubling that really is. But if the House passes a resolution of inherent contempt and orders the Sergeant at Arms to do this thing, I don't know what they say to it. And of course, you could fire the Sergeant at Arms and decide, okay, Ronny Jackson's the Sergeant at Arms now. I know we just put him on the Intelligence Committee, but he's not going to do any of the work. He's the Sergeant at Arms. Or one of our crazy ass Navy SEALs. Get one of them. They'll be the Sergeant at Arms. There'll be no end of volunteers. But what can they do? I
don't see the end game to this one at all.
There isn't anything clear out there about that, and I don't know. I assume stalemate and then more negotiations, but I mean the only thing there is left is there's the recording. That's what they want. They can't really have it I mean, they've got every reason to deny it to them. On the other hand, I guess, the Republicans are saying, well, if we have the transcript, why not just give us the tape? And, I don't know, maybe.
And of course, the reason not to give them the tape is because this is entirely political, and what they're going to do with this tape is chop it up into embarrassing slices for President Biden. So, Biden's asserted executive privilege.
It makes no sense.
This was one case where executive privilege works.
Yeah.
He has complete authority to do so legitimately.
And it's violative of DOJ policy. They're not charging him. And so...
And it's just, the part of this that's disturbing is that apparently Mike Johnson signed off on Luna doing this and said she's going to get a vote.
Yeah, that's real. I mean, I guess he's afraid of having the speakership vacated again. But yeah, this is a bomb that you don't know where the fallout is going. So those are the kinds you don't push the button on.
Right.
But not Mike Johnson, because presumably, and we have this same problem with the government of Israel. Two major outposts of democracy that say, we're just going to let God settle this one. And I don't know.
Yikes.
Yeah, it doesn't really work that way. God frequently fails to answer in these cases. Maybe for good reason, but that's not the way things are supposed to work. So, all right, it's going to be an interesting summer. Getting warm where you are?
It is.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Joan, for keeping us up to date on all of these crazy things. And we'll probably have some, worse news to discuss with respect to the Supreme Court by next week.
I am sure we will.
Okay. Well, don't hold your breath. That's bad for you.
Okay.
Stay well, and we'll talk to you in a week.
All right. Bye-bye.
All right. Take care. Time now for us to hand things back to the programmed response to follow our show as Justice is on travel this week.
With David Waldman.
Although, who knows? Maybe I have some details already in my inbox. No, I don't. Okay. As I mentioned, travel week for Justice Putnam, and time then for me to get the hell out of here more or less at 11 on the dot these days to hand things over for the patchwork programming to follow, and we'll see you again tomorrow.